Hi everyone, I hope everybody's doing well this morning. I have the honor to present our next key speaker. Her name is Dr. Ruth Shim, and she's gonna have this wonderful presentation and conversation with all of us today titled Structural Racism and Mental Health, Challenges and Opportunities. Dr. Ruth Shim is the Luke and Grace King Professor in Cultural Psychiatry and Professor of Clinical Psychiatry in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California. She also serves as Associate Dean of Diverse and Inclusive Education at the University of California, Davis School of Medicine. Dr. Shim received an MPH in Health Policy from Rawlings School of Public Health at Emory University and an MD from Emory University School of Medicine. She's a member of the Board of Trustees of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the American Association for Community Psychiatry. She serves on the Research and Evaluation Committee of the California Mental Health Services Oversight and Accountability Commission. She also serves on the editorial boards of JAMA Psychiatry, Psychiatry Services, Community Mental Health Journal, and American Psychiatric Publishing, and is co-editor of the books The Social Determinants of Mental Health and the recently published Social Injustice and Mental Health. She's a former fellow of the Executive Leadership in Academic Medicine program and an at-large member of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Forum on Mental Health and Substance Use Disorders. Dr. Shim's research focuses on mental health disparities and inequities, and she provides clinical psychiatric care in the UC Davis Early Diagnosis and Preventative Treatment Clinic. Dr. Shim is wonderful. I had the opportunity to listen to a few of her presentations, and she's brilliant. She has a great capacity of sharing and talking about really complex topics in a way that's really understandable and memorable. So I'm really excited for her to be here with us. So without any more time, Dr. Shim, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you so much, Ari, for that wonderful introduction. I'm so pleased to be here virtually with all of you today. Hope that the weather in Texas and the rest of the southwest is tolerable for all of you. So we have a lot to discuss in a very short amount of time, and I really do like to leave a lot of time for discussion and questions because I think there's so much to this topic. So I'm going to launch right in. So we have a couple of things that we're going to be focusing on today. One, it's really important that we all are on the same page in terms of concepts, definitions. And so we're going to spend some time thinking about key concepts associated with structural racism and mental health. We're also going to evaluate the evidence base of the impact of structural racism on behavioral health outcomes. And finally, we are going to start to identify solutions to dismantle structural racism in psychiatry. And I say start because it is a big, daunting, and challenging task. But this is the beginning, hopefully, of an extended journey. So before I talk about any issues as it relates to race and racism, I always have to make a disclaimer. And I always tell people that when we give scientific talks, we often make disclosures. I actually don't have any disclosures, but I do have to make this disclaimer because of the topic. So the topic is difficult and it's uncomfortable. And so when we talk about issues like race and racism, complex feelings often emerge. Those feelings include things like guilt and anger, resentment, and defensiveness. Other emotions that people experience when we talk about these issues are that you may perceive me of accusing you of being racist or sexist or any number of other kind of negative things. And you also may feel that I have some sort of specific political agenda or that I lack objectivity. And I have to state this disclaimer only because all of these things have been told to me in feedback when I've brought up these issues or talked about these issues before. So it's really important that you all are prepared for these emotions that may rise in you and these feelings that you may feel when we talk about these topics. I always also tell people that if we're going to be talking about these things and those emotions do rise up, I think it's helpful to rely on the words of James Baldwin, He said that I'm not interested in anybody's guilt. Guilt is a luxury that we can no longer afford. I know you didn't do it and I didn't do it either, but I am responsible for it because I am a man and a citizen of this country, and you are responsible for it for the very same reason. So let's put the complex emotions aside as best we can, and let's kind of dive into this topic. So when we talk about the concept of social injustice as it relates to mental health, it's really challenging. And when we think about structural racism, it's really challenging, mainly because we've been socialized to believe that it is not polite to talk about race or racism or oppression. This starts when we're children. I have plenty of stories of odd and strange moments that occurred when I was growing up because people tried to dance around race and racism in almost amusing results. Also, health professionals have not been taught about the connection between oppression and health. Medical school and other health professional schools have a long tradition of teaching a concept of biological determinism, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And the other reason why it's hard to talk about these topics is because since the change and focus on racial justice that occurred in the middle of last year, I think that some people are kind of weary and tired of this topic. They feel that maybe there's been an overemphasis or an overcorrection in thinking about race and racial equity. And so some people are just fatigued and don't really want to spend any more time thinking about these concepts. So that's why it's hard, but we can do hard things. So I think it's important for us to think about why race is so important and critical when we talk about these issues. Sorry about that. So the problem with thinking about race and race-based medicine, and particularly mental health, is that race is a social and political construct. This is a term that's kind of bounced about and stated over and over and over again, but yet it's still very complex for people to understand. So we do not actually have accurate biological categorizations that we can make by race. It is very difficult because race is not something that was created related to science or biology. It was created to advance certain capitalistic structures like slavery and other injustices. So it was created as a form of social and political categorization. So when we say it's not a biological category, it's a social and political construct, it almost implies that it's not important. It almost implies that it's not incredibly significant. It is very significant. It's just that the origins of that significance are not what we always assume it to be. But we do know that race is a rough and imprecise proxy for culture, genetics, and for socioeconomic status. And yet we use race to confirm our assumptions, our prejudices, and our biases about our patients, our clients, or anybody that we work with, or even our people that are close to us in our life. The problem with thinking about this when we think about mental health is that imprecision really gets in the way of us providing good care and providing good services to people. If we're using it as a proxy for all these other things, the question becomes, why aren't we just looking at those things? Or why aren't we trying to understand those things, especially when that proxy may not be particularly accurate? So here's a quote that I want us to just take a minute to consider. It says that African Americans have higher incarceration rates, higher unemployment, lower incomes, lower home and business ownership, less education, less healthcare, more disease, and lower life expectancy than whites. If you believe Blacks are naturally dumb, sick, criminal, you have your answer for these discrepancies. If, however, you resist using stereotypes to make sense of your world, institutional racism provides a very practical and very traceable explanation for the inferior societal position of African Americans. I think it's really important to think about this particular quote because, unfortunately, at least in medicine, at least in my medical experience in medical school, in my psychiatry training, in the ways that we have approached people with serious mental illness or substance use disorders, oftentimes we default to this idea that perhaps Blacks and other people of color are naturally dumb or sick or criminal. There's not this idea to maybe move beyond that thought, to really understand where these differences, where all of these differences are coming from. There's a general tacit acceptance that we have our explanation for this inferior societal position. So let's talk a little bit about how we got to this place, how we got to a moment where we could kind of just sit back and say, oh, these inferior societal positions are because of natural differences among us. So this is a painting of the Declaration of Independence and the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And we all know that beautiful quotation that came from the Declaration: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And this really is the ideals by which this country was founded, and they're beautiful, wonderful ideals. The problem, of course, is that we know that with the founding, as you can see with this picture, that at that time, at this creation of this country, all men were not created equal, and that there was not this idea. First of all, there were not men or women were not considered to be equal, and then people of color were not considered to be equal. And you look at this picture, and there's this idea of the American dream, where if you work hard enough, if you do everything right, you can pull yourself up from your bootstraps and you can be successful. But unfortunately, the ways that we structured our society from the beginning were that certain people were allowed certain advantages, certain people were allowed certain benefits compared to other populations. And so some people were given additional advantages and additional supports, and other people were given disadvantages and were harmed. So a couple of years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, a physician by the name of Samuel Cartwright started thinking about mental illness as it was observed in slaves. And he was considered to be an expert on the mental health of slaves. And so he described two particular conditions that he noticed that were mental illnesses associated with the slave population. So one was this concept of drapetomania. And this was a condition, a disease that he described in slaves, in which they had a desire to run away from slavery. And so he conceptualized this as a mental illness. And he said that if any one or more of them at any time are inclined to raise their heads to a level with their master or overseer, humanity and their own good requires that they should be punished until they fall into that submissive state that was intended for them to occupy. They have only to be kept in that state and treated like children to prevent and cure them from running away. So, of course, the idea that somebody would want to escape slavery, would want to escape this type of captivity, from his perspective, was in fact a mental health problem. He also described an additional condition called dysesthesia ethiopica. This was a disease of rascality, or what he described as kind of the natural state of Black people to be lazy, to not want to work hard. So he said that, and he observed this in a certain population of slaves. He said the disease is the natural offspring of Negro liberty, the liberty to be idle, to wallow in filth, and to indulge in improper food and drinks. After the prescribed course of treatment, the slave will look grateful and thankful to the white man whose compulsory power has restored his sensation and dispelled the mist that clouded his intellect. So it's important for us to think about the context of these conditions that Cartwright was describing, because he really was saying that, again, he kind of conceptualized these illnesses without any sort of context. So there was no talk in this idea that slaves were naturally lazy or did not want to work. There was no discussion or consideration of the brutal hours and extensive hyperproductivity that slaves had in the context of being often majorly withheld calories, high levels of malnutrition. They were not fed properly, and yet still managed to put out an incredible amount of work. And yet for Dr. Cartwright, that was still not enough from his perspective. So without this context, he created an understanding of certain mental health problems that really lacked the nuance of recognizing what context is. Unfortunately, we see that kind of extending out into the ways that we practice mental health today. And I'll also just point out that he had recommended treatments for both of these conditions, and that was whipping. So I want to define the concept of health disparities and compare that to the concept of health inequities, because there are two very different things, but we talk about them all the time. So health disparities are differences in health status among distinct segments of the population, including differences that occur by gender, race or ethnicity, education or income, disability, or where you live. Now contrast that with the definition of health inequities. Health inequities are disparities in health that are the result of systemic, avoidable, and unjust social and economic policies and practices that create barriers to opportunity. It's really important to think about the differences in these two concepts. And the reason for that is because when you think about the health disparities, which is what we describe the differences that we see in mental health and substance use disorders and general health conditions, we often talk about them and say that they're health disparities. But because we have not necessarily described the origin of these health disparities, we've just said that there's a difference. And that's very different from this concept of health inequities, which is saying that there are specific reasons why these differences have come to be, and that those specific reasons are systemic, avoidable, and unjust social and economic policies and practices. If you don't think about really what is the cause of the difference, you have a risk of defaulting to thinking that the cause is some type of internal or intrinsic cause, or maybe it's a population level group cause, that this particular population has this difference because there's something culturally about that group or something intrinsically different biologically about that group that leads to that difference. And if you think about all of the different outcomes that we see in mental health, when we compare it to different populations, ask yourself, are these differences intrinsic differences that just exist between these populations, or are these differences systemic, avoidable, and unjust social and economic policies and practices? And I would venture to say that almost every difference that we see in mental health can be traced at least partly to systemic, avoidable, and unjust social and economic policies and practices. For example, we see higher rates of depression in women compared to men. And so if we're thinking about that as a health disparity, we might say that maybe that has something to do with estrogen, and that women have different hormone levels, and that leads to them having different rates of depression compared to men. But if we're thinking about this from a health inequity perspective, we really understand that we exist in a very patriarchal society, one in which women are highly subject to high rates of violence, high rates of trauma. They have been oppressed in multiple ways, and that those policies and practices are the things that lead to these higher rates of depression. So that gets us to this definition of the social determinants of mental health. They are the societal, environmental, and economic conditions that impact and affect mental health outcomes across various populations. These conditions are shaped by the distribution of money, power, and resources at global, national, and local levels, which are themselves influenced by policy choices. And finally, and most importantly, these social determinants of health are prominently responsible for the health disparities and inequities, and I would just say we could just say health inequities that are seen within and among populations. So let's think about that. We're saying that these inequities are the result, again, of social determinants of health, the social and environmental and economic conditions that affect health outcomes. And so the way that I've been thinking about this over the years has to do with some concepts that I've been contemplating over, I would say, the last 10 years or so. So the first was thinking about the social determinants of mental health. And in a book that I published with Michael Compton a little over 5 years ago, that book really sought to gather all of the evidence that was available to describe how social factors and those environmental and social conditions lead to poor mental health and poor health outcomes. And that was really great work. That actually led to my understanding of what was really kind of the underlying factors of the creation of the social determinants of mental health. And that led to really exploring social injustice in mental health. And I recently did that in this book with Sarah Vinson. But I'm going to kind of run through my mindset and how this process works really quickly with this figure. And it looks very busy, but I promise you it's actually pretty easy to go through. So at the very top of this image, you see adverse mental health outcomes and mental health inequities. And so those are the outcomes. This is kind of what we end up with, what we have pretty regularly in our society. Right before those adverse mental health outcomes or mental health inequities, you could say either going upstream, or you could say if you move down this figure, either one, you see a number of risk factors. So we know that risk factors are something that precede an illness and increase the likelihood that someone will develop that illness. And they include things like reduced options and poor choices and behavioral risk factors and physiological stress responses and psychological stress. And in mental health work, we're often taught that we need to identify risk factors. We do suicide risk assessments. We do any number of other risk assessments. We're taught to identify risk factors. And the idea is if you intervene at the level of the risk factor, perhaps you can prevent the development of that disease. My work on the social determinants of mental health has helped me to understand that if we are intervening at the level of the risk factor, often we're too late. Because there are these upstream things, these things that have really driven the development of the risk factor that we have not accounted for. And so that is when we would need to move further upstream or to think about the context that created the risk factor. So Lincoln Phelan called that the fundamental causes of disease. Sir Michael Marmot and Jeffrey Rose say that these are the causes of the causes. So those causes of the causes are the social determinants of mental health. And so you see in these 4 boxes a number. This is not a complete list of all of the social determinants, but it is a number of social determinants, including adverse early life experiences, discrimination, exposure to violence, low education, underemployment and unemployment, poverty, of course, homelessness, food insecurity, transportation insecurity, access to health care, the built environment, neighborhood disorder, pollution exposure, climate change. So a number of factors. These are the social determinants. They set the context for the creation of the risk factor, and that leads to adverse mental health outcomes and mental health inequities. But as I've started to think about social injustice, I've come to understand that if you are intervening at the level of the social determinant, you are still intervening too late, because there is a number of drivers that set the context that create the social determinants of mental health. And those drivers are unfair and unjust distribution of opportunity. And the thing that sets the stage for that are public policies, the laws that we pass in society, and social norms, the beliefs that we have about certain populations and certain groups. So our ideas about who is valuable, who is worthy of advantage, and who is not, informs the laws and the policies that we create in our society to function. And then once we create those laws in society, that leads to an unfair and unjust distribution of opportunity, which creates the social determinants of mental health, which leads to the risk factor, which leads to the mental health inequities. So if we were to describe how this all works, we could think about substance use disorders. So if you think about crack cocaine, we all have a very clear understanding of crack cocaine. We know that generally African Americans, and particularly in the early 80s, African Americans were more likely to use crack cocaine and white Americans were more likely to use powder cocaine, even though they were the same drug. So think about the belief systems, the social norms that we have around people who use crack cocaine. Generally, I think that if we were being fully honest, we would say that most of our thoughts about crack, especially in the 80s, were that these people were morally bankrupt, criminals, people that really didn't care about anybody else but themselves. They were bad people. They were people, as you can see, mothers were depicted as not caring about their babies, creating this situation where their children were put at risk, and they didn't care. Men who used crack cocaine were considered to be dangerous, violent murderers that needed to be controlled. And so those were our social norms. Those were our beliefs about this population. And then what happened was we passed laws. We passed a number of laws, including a 100-to-1 jail sentence disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. That was later changed to 18-to-1, but it's really shocking to think that we had that law, considering that crack cocaine and powder cocaine are the same substance. But yet we felt the need to pass a law to specifically distinguish the sentencing for this. So based on our social norms, we created policies that reflected those values, that created an unfair, unjust distribution of opportunity, and set the stage for a number of social determinants of mental health. But the other thing that our social norms did was it really had us believing that crack cocaine use disorder was some type of criminal problem as opposed to a medical problem or a health problem. And so Ernest Drucker in A Plague of Prisons said that the fundamental clinical accountability of drug treatment professionals to individual patients has been subordinated to the goals of the criminal justice system. So you didn't really see back then, and even now, a concerted effort to treat crack cocaine use disorders as a public health problem, as a medical condition that needed treatment. It was really about putting people who use crack cocaine in jail. If you were very, very lucky, perhaps you could get treatment in jail, but most people did not get that. And let's just contrast that with how we've dealt with or conceptualized the opioid epidemic. Because we think about mothers who use crack cocaine as these horrible people who don't care about their children, but yet we think about mothers who use opioids as people that are struggling to help themselves as well as their children. And we have passed laws that particularly reflect that. We think of the opioid epidemic as a public health crisis. We've created policies to make it easy for us to access X waivers and other types of treatment for people with opioid use disorders. We do not throw people with opioid use disorders in jail routinely. So again, this is how we see our social norms reflecting the laws that we pass that creates this unfair and unjust distribution of opportunity. So let's go over a couple of more key concepts. One, I think when we're talking about these concepts, we really need to understand the ideas of oppression. And Iris Marion Young described the 5 faces of oppression. So these are exploitation, the unequal exchange of one group's labor and energies for another group's advantage and advancement. You can think, of course, very clearly about slavery as a form of exploitation, but also trafficking that exists today, human trafficking, whether that be sex trafficking or labor trafficking, is another example of exploitation. Even migrant farm workers are exploited. And so there are many examples of oppression as it relates to exploitation. Cultural imperialism is establishing the ruling class culture as the norm and othering any groups that are not part of that dominant culture. We often see this in mental health. We tend to think that the ruling class culture, which traditionally is white men, that they do not have any sort of pathology. We kind of rate everything else in comparison. So they are the reference group, and then any behavior that is not that behavior is considered to be abnormal, is considered to be wrong. So they are the basis by which we judge what is considered to be okay and correct. Powerlessness is when oppressed groups lack power or are blocked from routes to gaining power. I think a perfect example of powerlessness is voter suppression and keeping people from being represented. But also you can see this on the small scale, lack of representation or keeping community members from engaging around issues that affect them directly. Marginalization is expelling specific groups from meaningful participation in society. We've seen this throughout history, particularly with indigenous populations, but also with Asian American populations as well. And then violence are threats and experiences of physical and structural violence. I think that speaks for itself, but I will just say that structural violence is when harm is done from people in power to people that have less power, and it does not necessarily have to be physical. So it is any type of harm that is done within the hierarchy. A couple of other principles. One is the idea of essentialism. We think about this a lot in medicine. This idea that there are these distinct, unchanging, and natural characteristics that define social groups and facilitate their categorization. In medicine, we like to categorize things. We like to put people, we're taught to do that. We like to put people into boxes. But unfortunately, human beings do not box well. So even as we are taught to put people into these categories and define these groups, if we really kind of fall prey to essentialism, we often make a lot of mistakes, a lot of errors based on that. Another concept is erasure of context. I've already described this specifically when talking about Samuel Cartwright, but this is a failure to consider socio-historical context when seeking to understand the etiology of inequities. Biological determinism is the false belief that racial groups are biologically and genetically different. And you know, when I mentioned that quote before about Black people and what we believe, I think that biological determinism has reigned supreme for many, many years throughout medicine. The idea that even though we know that there is more genetic variability within a racial group than there are across racial groups, we still have this belief that somehow there are these biological differences. And they actually did a study of medical students very recently in the last 5 years, in which they asked them about things like they endorsed beliefs such as Black people have thicker skin than white people, or Black people have less nerve endings than white people. And those beliefs then lead to a difference in practice in terms of how much pain medication we give to populations. Cultural determinism is the false belief that differences in racial groups are the result of cultural factors. So just as easily as we can fall into this trap of biological determinism, we can also fall into the same trap of cultural determinism, where we say, oh, those differences in these groups are because of this particular group's belief system, because of the way this particular group, the foods that this particular group eats, the values that this particular group has, and that is just as damaging or just as dangerous as biological determinism. So there are several different types of discrimination, including legal and illegal discrimination. When I say legal and illegal, legal, of course, is things like the Jim Crow laws are probably the best example of that. But illegal discrimination is when you have specific protected class. So there are certain things that say that you cannot discriminate against people based on race or creed or religion. Those members of those protected classes, it is illegal to discriminate. If you're not a member of a protected class, you can actually be discriminated against. So that any form of discrimination in terms of when we think about employment law, it's legal if you're not a member of that particular protected class. There can be overt or covert discrimination, where it's really obvious you're being discriminated against, versus this idea where you're really unclear as to whether discrimination is happening. Covert is almost similar to the concept of microaggressions. And then you can have different levels of discrimination. You can have interpersonal or individual. We think about this all the time. We talk about it all the time. When we hear about incidents that happen, when we hear about in the news about people being harmed by discrimination and racism, it's often interpersonal. But there's also institutional or organizational level discrimination and also structural or systemic. So I think it's important for us to spend some time thinking about what structural or systemic racism is. So structural racism is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. And it is a system that identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. It is not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. Instead, it's been a feature of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist. And it does not require the actions or intentions of others, meaning that we can all be good, well-meaning, anti-racist people, and structural mechanisms and structural racism can continue to exist. And just to kind of hammer that point home, if we eliminated all of the interpersonal discrimination that exists in society today, all of those individual interactions that we hear about so commonly, we would still have racial and ethnic inequities due to the persistence of structural racism. So let's talk a little bit about social injustice as it relates to mental health. We've already described it as we talked about the war on drugs, and particularly crack cocaine versus opioid use disorders. Let's also talk a little bit about residential segregation and how you can see structural racism impact that. So you've seen these redlining maps in which certain communities were deemed to be acceptable places to live, and then other communities of color were redlined. And then as a result of that redlining, those communities were systematically disinvested in. So services were removed from those communities, including things like fire departments and particularly health clinics. So there were no health clinics built or located in areas that were considered to be redline communities. So as a result of residential segregation, even now you can see large swaths of communities that have no access to healthcare, no access to any services. We can see residential segregation at play right now as it relates to the COVID pandemic, because people that are trying to get vaccinations, people of color and particularly African Americans, have to travel farther to get a vaccine than white populations. They have to often drive hours to get to the nearest vaccination site compared to white populations. And they've done some really interesting data on that. So residential segregation is a huge driver of differences in outcomes as it relates to health. Immigration policy is also a really important example of structural racism. It can be as blatant as something like the Chinese Exclusion Act or the Page Act, in which people from certain countries are not allowed directly to immigrate into this country. So a banning of certain populations from coming into this country. But also we have this concept of the healthy immigrant effect. And we don't often think about the fact that our immigration policy has helped to create the healthy immigrant effect, because we do screenings to prevent certain people from coming into this country, specifically certain populations, certain people from certain countries, but also people with certain conditions. So if you have a mental health problem or a substance use problem, you will not be able to come to immigrate into the United States. You will be screened out. So what happens is that the people that are kind of able to immigrate to the United States are the healthiest of that particular country. And then we compare that particular population to people in the United States already, and we say, oh, this population is healthier. It must be something to do with this country, some sort, again, we default to the disparity explanation. There must be some intrinsic difference between people coming from this country versus the people that are here in our country. And we haven't thought about the policies that we've created that have stratified that. The Social Security Act of 1935 is this great policy that created retirement, created Social Security retirement, allowed older adults to be able to not be so stressed and financially anxious about what they would do after they stopped working. Also allowed them to pass wealth on to their children. So it helped to create financial stability for generations. The reason that the Social Security Act is an example of structural racism in health is because when it was passed in the 1930s, it was a condition of it passing in the Senate was that Southern senators required that agricultural and domestic workers be excluded from participation in the Social Security Act. And it just so happened that the majority of agricultural and domestic workers at that time in the South were African American. And so an entire population of African American people were not allowed to participate, even though they worked their entire lives like everyone else. They could not then retire at the same age as other people with some financial security. So they had to continue with that financial anxiety and stress. And they also could not pass wealth on to their children and to their grandchildren. And so you started to see this huge wealth gap start to develop after the Social Security Act as a result. So this wealth inequity started to really take off after the Social Security Act. And then finally, mental health care. I'll briefly talk about this. This is data from SAMHSA. It shows that in 2018, about 69% of Black adults with any mental illness received no treatment, and 67% of Latinx adults with any mental illness received no treatment. And when it came to serious mental illness, about 42% of Black adults and 44% of Latinx adults received no mental health treatment for their serious mental illness. If we think about substance use disorders, it gets even worse. 89% of Latinx adults with substance use disorders reported receiving no treatment, and 88% of Black adults also received no treatment. So if we're going to ponder this based on what I've been talking about for the last 40 minutes, if we were to say, what are the reasons why people, Black and Latinx people, do not access treatment? If we were to think about this from a disparity lens or from a cultural determinism lens, we might say Black and Latinx adults have more stigma. They have culturally, they're very different from white Americans. They think that mental health is culturally, they don't believe in mental illness. They have different beliefs. They may mistrust the providers in the system. We might even say that they lack an understanding of how serious mental health problems are. They have no insight. But if we were to actually look at the data, and particularly this is data that looked at healthcare reasons for Blacks in the United States, cost was the most commonly cited reason that people did not seek care. And so that was about twice as often as minimizing symptoms and nearly 5 times as often as stigma. So we have this idea, this narrative of why people aren't engaging, why we're not reaching a certain population, but really it has to do with the way our health and mental health system has been structured, the way it was built, the way it was designed to make it so that few people can actually access and afford to get appropriate mental health services. So in the little bit of time I have left, and I realize I don't have that much time left, I'm gonna talk about where we might try to go if we're gonna be successful here. So currently we're in this state of inequality. We have unequal access to opportunities, as you can see in this figure. And many people think that the solution is equality. A lot of people are focused in on, we need to be fair. Whatever we do to solve this problem, we need to make sure that we're fair. That everybody gets the same tools, everybody gets the same assistance, and that's the most important priority. But I will say that, as you can see with this figure, that doesn't really get us to where we're trying to go. So one of the goals has to be equity. We need to create custom tools that address and identify the inequality. So it's less focused on fairness and it's more focused on giving people what they need to be successful. So targeted interventions that specifically help those people that need more. But that cannot be the only piece of the goal. The other piece is really about justice. It's really about fixing the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. And that is when you're really talking about getting to the structural solutions that we're looking for. So if we're going to eliminate social injustice and eliminate structural racism in mental health, I'm recommending 4 major areas that we can focus on. One is education and self-reflection. The next is promoting social norms of inclusion, equity, and respect, advocating for equitable public policies, and finally speaking up and taking a stand. So on education and self-reflection, I would say that mental health providers are very well trained. They know a lot about mental health things, but they know very little about the dynamics of race and racism. It is not taught. It is not routinely taught anywhere. It's not taught in elementary school or middle school or college. And so it's certainly not taught in mental health professional schools. So this requires us to take responsibility to do our own education in this space. And the good news is that there are a lot of books that can help us understand these concepts. And many of these books are not completely difficult to read, but I've put up a list of some of them because some of them are in fact more dense than others. And so I also would say that if reading is not your thing, or if the density is too much, that this particular list is a much more easily digestible list of resources. So some of these books are just easier to read and to absorb. But also I have a number of podcasts on this list, which are particularly helpful, like the 1619 Project and Seeing White. And then the documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, also provides a lot of really important insight. So one of the things we need to do is think about this concept of cultural humility. And this was described by Melanie Trevelyan and Jan-Marie Garcia. Cultural humility involves committing to a lifelong process of self-evaluation and self-critique. It is really a desire to fix power imbalances between providers and clients. And it's about developing community partnerships to advocate within the larger organizations in which we participate. So when we think about education and self-reflection, we have to say that it's not that we're going to read a couple books and then we're going to be experts, but this is a commitment that we all have to make, that we're constantly working on for the rest of our lives. This is an ongoing process that will take, it will be a lifelong process. So we need to practice cultural humility, but we also need to work on practicing structural competence. So structural competence was described by Jonathan Metzl and Helena Hansen as the trained ability to discern how a host of issues defined as symptoms, clinical problems, attitudes, or diseases are influenced by upstream social determinants of health. And so that's really being able to, instead of focusing on cultural competence, it's really about how all of the things we've just talked about, how did all of those structures, how when we're looking at the person in front of us, and we're trying to help the client that's directly in front of us, how are we contemplating how these social determinants have impacted them? How have they affected how they're presenting, what illness they're presenting with, their understanding of how those illnesses have been created. And so the next thing I mentioned were social norms and public policies, because as we remember with that figure, they're really driving everything. So we need to promote social norms of inclusion, equity, and respect. And here's another James Baldwin quote for you. We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. So if we're going to promote social norms of inclusion and respect, we need to enforce these social norms in all of our community settings, where we work, where we live, every aspect of our lives. And the ways that we can enforce these social norms, including education or legislation. So we can educate, because many times people who violate social norms of inclusion and equity do so because they have a lack of understanding. It's mostly ignorance. It's having not been exposed to that particular population before. So education can be very powerful. Legislation is needed when all of the education in the world does not reach somebody. Unfortunately, we do have people that are committed to their hate. And in that case, that legislation and laws can be used to prevent those people from doing damage to populations. So keeping folks from interacting with populations, removing them from settings in which they would harm people. We need to observe and challenge our own implicit biases. This is, again, remember we said a lifelong process. I will just tell you that when I have been working on these issues, one of the most disappointing things about this is that the more you understand implicit bias, the better you get at noticing it. And so I'm now at this point where I'm constantly noticing my biases, and that is very demoralizing, especially because most of us have a really strong belief system about what is right and what is wrong. And when you identify biases that don't that conflict with that belief system, it can be hard. And so I would also say that in this work, I think it's important to give yourself a lot of grace and a lot of leeway to understand that these are natural processes, and it's okay to have beliefs that aren't consistent with your values, to have automatic beliefs that aren't necessarily consistent with your values. And then I think we need to evaluate and break down unnecessary hierarchies. There are some places and settings in which it's really important for us to have hierarchical differences, but most of the time they're set up just because people in power like to feel good about themselves. And so in those situations, we can break those down. Very quickly, I'll talk about advocating for equitable public policies. That requires us to take action beyond the walls of our clinics and hospitals and treatment centers to advocate for policies that address social determinants of mental health. It involves communicating with our elected officials and promoting equitable representation and forming cross-sector collaborations and community coalitions. So to wrap it up, I will say that political stances and policy interventions are required. To remain apolitical or neutral is, in fact, a political stance because it is a tacit acceptance of the status quo. And so this is my point about speaking up and taking a stand, which is so important. And so I like to quote Audre Lorde when I think about this. When we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed, but when we are silent, we are still afraid, so it is better to speak. So it's really important that all of us speak up and take a stand when we notice that somebody is violating social norms of inclusion and equity and respect. That is how we begin to make this change. And so I'd like to leave you with the concept of progress, which is that we have been making a lot of progress in this space. It is made through the passage of legislation, court rulings, and other formal mechanisms that aim to promote racial equality. But I think that we would all be remiss if we just accepted and got excited when progress is made without being ready for the inevitable retrenchment that always comes when progress is made. So retrenchment refers to the ways in which progress is very often challenged, neutralized, or undermined in key policy arenas. And if you're not prepared for that retrenchment, it can be very demoralizing when it comes. It will always come, and it will be very demoralizing if you're not prepared for it. And so to end, I will say that these words always inspire me when I'm caught in a moment of despair around retrenchment. And these are words from Congressman John Lewis. He said, "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is a struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble." Thank you.